The ICF Training and Technical Assistance team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF. I will be hosting today's session. Today's session is our final community workshop, part of our community workshop series, and is entitled Coordinated Street Outreach and Effective Encampment Response. It's my privilege to introduce today's first presenter, Tom Albanese. Tom, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And good morning, everyone. Tom Albanese, consultant working with the ICF team there in California. I'm actually based in Columbus, Ohio. I go by he, him pronouns. And just by way of quick background, I'm a 30-year licensed social worker. Spent a lot of time in the Columbus system, both with the Community Shelter Board, supporting the system here and also in other parts of Ohio. And then like my colleague Matt, who I'll introduce here in a second, do a lot of technical assistance around the country with communities, large and small. So Matt, why don't you introduce yourself and then I'll go through the agenda.
Sure. Matt White, also part of the ICF consulting team. I use he, him pronouns, and also based in Columbus, Ohio with Tom. Although my background is not clinical, my training is in city and community planning. And so my approach to this work comes from a systems planning perspective. And I'm always thankful to work with Tom, who has sort of skills and expertise in both of those areas, both clinical and systems work, and we'll be kind of sort of bouncing back and forth and sharing perspectives from both of those experiences.
Thanks, Matt. Thrilled to be here with you as well. And let's just go through the agenda super quick. This is what we want to get through in the next hour and a half. We're going to leave a lot of time for questions and discussion at the end, but I'll just say at the top here as well, Matt and I are really comfortable being interrupted and having questions kind of thrown out or insights, things that you all have done or seen. We would love to just hear what's going on. We all have our own kind of background and expertise to share. So we're just really excited to have a dialogue. But we do want to spend some time talking about the goals and role of street outreach, just to level set a little bit, including how teams are configured and what some of the staffing approaches look like, what the goals for street outreach coordination are. And then we're going to dive into principles and practices for street outreach and coordination of street outreach and how to effectively engage and help people resolve literal homelessness when they're living in an encampment together, and how to do that in a coordinated way that results in successful housing or other types of outcomes. And Matt's going to share with us as we talk through that some really amazing community examples that he's actually directly helped with. Excited to learn more about that personally and professionally. And then also we're going to spend some time just talking about data and some of the emerging information that's out there that's really pertinent to this conversation today. We want to get in front of you. So that's what we're intending to do. We're just going to go ahead and dive in. And again, if you have questions or just comments or insights as we go through, don't hesitate to pop them in the chat, raise your hand. Chris is keeping an eye on things as well. And we'll throw things at us as you've got it. So let's just talk quickly. Matt and I sort of putting this together thought it'd be helpful to just sort of start with a common conception and understanding of what the goals and role of street outreach are in all its iterations. And part of it is just understanding all its iterations. As many of you probably know, I'm sure some of you actually do street outreach or have a real depth of experience. This might be old news to you or just really easily understood. Some of us are newer to this and just are trying to get our hands around all the various approaches to street outreach that communities are using and that programs use to help people in need. Broadly speaking, if we consider the role of street outreach in a community, there's various roles that street outreach plays. First, of course, providing sort of a standalone, a specific type of programmatic intervention. It could be service and housing focused or full service kind of outreach team that provides comprehensive clinical and rehousing assistance and other basic needs assistance for a given population from start to finish. These are really more full-fledged, we might call them sometimes case carrying teams that are really helping somebody in a holistic way. There's also more narrowly focused service teams that might be really just specialized in dealing with medical issues, for example, or other acute behavioral health issues. And then there's basic needs focused teams. In Columbus, there are teams that really focus primarily on making sure that people have food and safe lodgings, be that a tent or other support, and are facilitated to get into shelter. So they're really just dealing with that immediate basic need and helping people move to the next step as much as possible. There are other types of outreach, like entities, actors that communities need or that we see variations of, including those that focus on coordinated entry system or CES access and sort of facilitating that very specifically and having a very defined role, conducting assessment and navigating to shelter and rehousing and other services within the system. And then, of course, there's functionally speaking, and you're going to hear this a lot from Matt and I both, there really needs to be an emphasis, and sometimes this is lacking, around housing coordination and navigation, and really helping people move from the street to housing and stabilize in housing. This is oftentimes, you'll see this as a rapid rehousing program that has a street outreach component. So they've got some staff who work with people in unsheltered situations to basically do street to home assistance. And that's sort of what we mean by housing coordination and navigation as a functional role. And then finally, just crisis response. We see teams of different variety really responding to people who might be having severe behavioral health issues or having some type of medical emergency or other types of acute need, or perhaps there's behavioral issues that are causing trouble in a given area. And you'll see teams like that. They're much more crisis oriented. So just to give you a flavor, kind of a lay of the land as far as the different functions and types of street outreach we see. And then as we dig down a little deeper, we also know that street outreach teams can be configured differently or structured differently. You can have a given agency that has its own outreach team. Sometimes you will see shelters that have their own outreach staff, and so they're sort of out in the field engaging folks, perhaps in a given geography that they serve. You'll see multidisciplinary teams that have sometimes up to and including medical and more master's level and higher clinical staff and vocational staff and peer specialists and so forth, who are really providing that full service complement. And then we see teams that sometimes are adjacent to or connected with other systems in our community, like criminal justice partners who might have some investment or staff sort of dedicated to partnering with or actually conducting street outreach, or in the public health space. And so forth. One example I think we see a lot of are improvement districts, local business districts, and other like non-typical, entities starting to collaborate and do more around people they're seeing who are unsheltered and investing in staff or solutions. And that's another way we're seeing some street outreach teams take shape in communities or in specific areas in communities. Regardless of the structure or the scope of any team, though, as we mentioned earlier, it's critical that every team has a team member who's responsible, who's accountable, right, for providing or ensuring that every person engaged can access individualized rehousing assistance. It's a fundamental obligation of every outreach team and every outreach staff member to make sure the person we're helping, if they're currently unhoused, that we are treating that de facto as a crisis, because it is. Even if that person has their immediate needs met and they've got a decent tent and their food is set for the night, even if they're hunky-dory or they seem like it at the moment, it is nonetheless a crisis, because when you're unsheltered, you're at higher risk for many things. And I think that's probably known to most of us here, but we want to underscore that importance on focus on housing and crisis resolution. So when we start to think about the different variety of outreach in our community and what that starts to look like, now we're really starting to get into brass tacks. And I think Matt can share lots of examples, and I can say from my own experience that when we start to get serious about ending unsheltered homelessness and helping people move more rapidly straight to housing, if need be through shelter, then we need to understand what we have to begin with. And that just specifically means we have to start to inventory our outreach capacity. And what are the teams that we have? How are they staffed? How are they funded? What is their goal? What are their accountabilities? Do they have outcomes that they are funded to achieve that match or don't match what the community needs in terms of helping people move from the street or an unsafe place into housing as quickly as possible? So looking at team configurations, staffing configurations is really important, and we have to do that with a level of detail that gives us actionable information. And so what you see here, I'm not going to read this to everyone, but you can see the types of things that you need to start to inventory or catalog. And this will help you then determine, do you have teams or areas or functional aspects that you need in a robust, comprehensive, geography-wide outreach endeavor that are not there yet? In other words, do you have a team perhaps that does a great job with access to basic needs and behavioral health care, but they don't really know how to navigate, and they don't have anybody on their team who's expert, or they're not connected into the coordinated access system or entry system that gets people to individualized rehousing assistance. So that's a gap. In Columbus, we did this just by way of example. We inventoried all of our street outreach capacity, and what we learned was we had, I forget the exact number right now, somewhere in the vicinity of 15 or so full-time equivalent staff who we could say were housing focused, that they spent the majority, if not all their time, helping people who were on the street obtain housing, providing that individualized assistance. And because we were able to identify how many FTE we had, we also estimated how many FTEs we needed. And the gap was something like 2 to 3 times the number of FTEs we currently had at that moment, who were housing focused. If you think of that as a basic building block, where a caseload doesn't exceed, say, 25 or so, maybe 30 cases, maybe a little bit more, but that's a stretch. Then you can start to size how much capacity you've got versus how much you need at the most basic level in terms of rehousing assistance. And that's a really important outcome of this type of exercise in drilling down. But you also need, of course, to identify other gaps. Geographic coverage. Can anybody access an outreach team no matter where they are in your county, in your city, in your geography? Is it known to people all across your geography how to access street outreach assistance? Is that through your front door to your homeless system? How does that happen? And where are the gaps, again, in knowledge or access? So this is all part of our due diligence to understand what we have. Once we do that, we can then start to, again, better organize what we have. And these are some of the objectives that we're trying to accomplish when we're now looking beyond just independent outreach efforts to a comprehensive, coordinated effort to end unsheltered homelessness and help people move from street to housing. If we think about it from that vantage point, then we can start to consider, where are the most important areas we need regular presence on site, in person, by a team, where somebody who is currently unhoused can readily access them? Where are those partners? Who are the partners that we need to make sure our outreach teams are coordinating with? How do we, in other words, ensure that full coverage? And most of all, as we do this, how do we make sure that anybody who is unhoused today has access to housing assistance? And this is why we can start to pivot from sort of a basic needs focus. As somebody I used to work with would say, we have to move beyond handing out umbrellas and flashlights to handing out housing vouchers and really individualized trauma-informed rehousing assistance. And how do we do that is really our objective here in this work, and fundamentally, and maybe most importantly, improving the experience and the outcomes of people who are unhoused and minimizing any harm or reducing harm as much as we can along the way. And that's really our important goal here. So I'm going to pass it off to Matt. Actually, it's a perfect segue. Matt's going to pick it up and talk a little bit more about principles and kind of move us forward.
Great.
Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. As I was thinking about the work that I've done in communities to help develop an outreach coordination plan or a strategy, and these are communities from Houston, Cleveland, Detroit, looked a little bit in Miami, and currently working in Portland. In each one of these communities, we always start by defining a set of guiding principles. The reason guiding principles are so useful or helpful is that there's often, and in every community that where I've worked, this has been the case. I haven't come across one where there's not. There will be tension. There will be decision points where we have to come together and agree how we're going to make a decision or how we're going to move forward. So spending the time to define a set of guiding principles, sort of your guardrails on what will you allow, or how will your system operate, or what is your North Star for organizing your approach, that will help not eliminate the conflict or the tension or the problems that you're going to face. Those are just, I think, a fact, but it helps you navigate them in a way that's going to be more productive. So the example here, and these are just from a sample from communities where I've worked, where these were really helpful as a way to organize their thinking and help to direct their decision-making. And the first one is that, first and foremost, we know from data that punitive approaches just don't work. They're not effective at engaging people. They don't resolve homelessness. They don't result in a housing placement. So just giving people citations or moving them along, or providing only kind of like just the minimal comfort and care is not going to result in long-term success. And so oftentimes just naming that and having that be a clear focus for the coordination plan, that we're going to be engagement and housing focused rather than punitive, can be really helpful. Another one that I find that each community has adopted is an acknowledgement that this is not the result of personal failings. And if we reorient our thinking around people who are in crisis as a safety net that has failed them, institutions and structures in the community that did not address their needs, it reorients us to think that people can be housed. They want to be housed. They want to be safe, free from harm, in a place that feels like their own, in a community that they define. And so that becomes a guiding principle for how we coordinate, or how one might coordinate outreach, including a client choice. And not just in terms of the housing placement, but who they get to live with, the geography or the neighborhood. Is it close to employment? Is it close to a bus line? Does it allow them to maintain their sense of what brings them satisfaction, or what brings them a sense of community? Tying that to their housing choice is really useful in ensuring long-term success. And so that becomes a guiding principle. Another useful one is that if a community were to assign all of outreach is the responsibility of agency X, and they're going to come up with the community's plan, and if it doesn't work, it's that particular agency, it's some failure of that particular agency. That I've never found that to be an effective approach. So redefining the solution to unsheltered homelessness as a community-wide response, and outreach as part of that community-wide system strategy. Also looking at how we encounter and engage people as not just a one and done, but persistence over time. And often there's a long history of trauma, of failed connections, experiences that have been negative. And so many people who are unsheltered require lots of contacts and steady, smooth engagement over time. And so defining that as the sort of principal element of outreach, that there's persistence and consistency over time, is ultimately going to be more successful. Moving people from an encampment or from an unsheltered location through their housing pathway often will require a stay in interim housing, whether that's shelter or some other interim component, but it has to be a low barrier so that people are transitioning to a housing placement in a way that meets their needs. If they're currently using substances, they have an untreated mental illness, they're with a community of people that they want to stay connected to, they have a pet or an animal that's important to them, they have belongings that are important. We need to make sure that the programming, the interim or crisis housing programming, allows those connections and allows those relationships to continue in a low barrier way. And then ultimately, permanent housing has to have, for many people, it has to be coupled with supports. That if we just move people into an apartment and sign a lease, unless there are active supports that are positioned with that housing, many people aren't going to be successful, and that what those supports or those services look like are going to be very different depending on the individual. And so packaging them in a way that's based on their needs, their goals, and their interests is going to be more helpful in the long run than just sort of a cookie cutter approach to the services. So articulating this set of guiding principles as one of the sort of the initial stages in developing an outreach plan can be really helpful. Let's look at some of the practice standards on the next slide, defining when we say outreach, what does that actually mean? What are outreach workers, or the practice of outreach? What is the expectation, or what does that actually look like? So defining a set of expectations, activities that underscore, that provide a foundation for what outreach is. First, we look at what are the core responsibilities of an outreach worker. They're obviously going to be doing, making attempts at contact and engaging people over time, but we might want to define as part of their core responsibilities some HMIS data collection and entry into HMIS. Maybe there's some coordination of care and coordinating not just with their team, but with other team, whether that's behavioral health, physical health, employment resources. Maybe their responsibilities are actually very housing focused. So looking at what's their responsibility for helping someone apply for housing and navigating and moving in that housing focused way. Another key element of practice standards is looking at how we develop a client-centered approach from the very beginning. What does that actually mean to say client-centered? So breaking that down into the component parts of identifying through an assessment or through a relationship-oriented engagement with the client, what are their specific goals? What do they want to achieve? What are their interests in life? And then tying their housing plan to their goals. So a perfect example here is oftentimes in my work, I've encountered people who have developed strong relationships in their unsheltered camp. And those relationships, because there might be fractured relationships with family or friends from the history, those become sort of their alternative family. So understanding that this is their family and they need to be housed with their redefined family or their friends or their support networks, that's a client-centered approach that's recognizing that that's ultimately their interest and that's going to help to contribute to long-term success. So that might be an example of a client-centered approach where we're letting them define what family is or what their community is, and developing a housing plan that honors and respects that. Developing clients' rights and choices as part of your practice standards. So if there's a violation of rights or perceived violation of rights, what's the process for a participant in an outreach program to voice a concern, to lodge a complaint? How does that get escalated? How does that get adjudicated in a way that, that protects their rights and their anonymity, but also supports their housing progress? So that might be defined as part of your practice standards for outreach. Providing housing-focused case management, looking at the essential elements of a case management relationship that's housing-focused and building that into outreach, and actually kind of delineating out or kind of the sequence of steps or the expectations for how a housing-focused case management relationship evolves or develops over time. Lots of issues around safety, not just for clients, but for staff. And so identifying what are the conditions under which maybe outreach is not an appropriate activity, whether it's the time or the place or the manner of the safety issue, and how staff can ensure their safety, whether that's either engaging with the police or doing team-oriented outreach, or if you see activities in a camp or an outreach that might be unsafe for clients, what's the responsibility of staff to name that, and then to ensure that we're, as much as possible, building a safe environment or ensuring a safe environment. And then what's your, for many outreach workers who are also licensed social workers, responsibilities for reporting if they see abuse or if they see unsafe conditions. What are their expectations to identify, call that out, and to escalate that to the appropriate authorities? Defining in your practice standards the process of doing an assessment, whether that's an assessment that's staged over time, one and done. Oftentimes there are, comprehensive psychosocial assessments. Sometimes there's more stepwise assessments that occur where you're building layers of information over time. So just articulating, what is that? What do we, when we say an assessment, what's the tool, what's the protocol, the timing, the staging of that? Supporting clients through their housing application and move-in process, if that is the expectation, and that is a best practice for outreach, but if that is the expectation for the outreach staff, not to transition someone to a housing navigator, but to actually support the housing application and move-in process as an outreach worker, then actually spelling that out as part of their duties and building that into your practice standards. And then just also, there will be natural transitions, transitions to a full-time case manager, maybe to a navigator if those functions are split in your community. If there's another care coordination or resource person that you're working with your client, ensuring that those transitions are successful, often with a warm handoff, is also part of the expectations for your shelter standards.
Matt, can I add in two more things? Just, I realize as you're running through this for us, there's two areas that we didn't add here, but we should probably highlight. One is around training and making sure your standards outline all those train. Actually, you probably take this entire list and you could crosswalk it to training content. And I say that specifically because I think, Matt, to your point around housing application and move-in process, if that is the specific obligation or responsibility of an outreach staff person, I've learned and really come to appreciate, people don't learn local systems and how to support somebody in the housing application process. They don't learn that by osmosis.
Yeah.
Our homeless systems and our agencies and our programs have to be intentional about making sure those training opportunities are baked into your hiring and your staffing plans, and you've got that fully outlined in an onboarding set of content areas for new staff and for existing staff, because each one of those areas is so critical, and sometimes we give them short shrift. And then the other area, Matt, I just wanted to lift up was training, as it were, but also standards around data collection. And you sort of touched on this earlier, but I think we've really come to appreciate the importance of street outreach staff using consistent, standardized approaches for data collection, specifically around engagement. I'll start with contacts, engagement, when engagement happens, intake, assessment, and maybe most of all, when somebody should be exited from an outreach project, and how do you make sure that's properly recorded, and what do you do when somebody disappears? And what is chronically a problem with outreach projects is oftentimes clients just remain open on the caseload. And this gives us an inaccurate picture. And as a community, we can't really see who's on the ground if that data isn't kept up to date. So I just want to underline that.
Those are great additions. Yeah, we should definitely include those in the. After we have our guiding principles and our practice standards drafted, the next thing I wanted to talk about was just doing an actual assessment of the encampment or of your unsheltered, the nature of unsheltered communities in your region. This actually grew out of an effort, it's in Houston, Texas, a very large dispersed geographic area. And there were probably 40 different encampments, and each of them was quite different. And as we, as a community, we're beginning to kind of sequence or stage our approach for decommissioning encampments, we needed to understand the unique characteristics or attributes within each encampment to help us understand the approach. There is not a sort of one size fits all. Each encampment had a slightly different engagement strategy. The resources were necessary to decommission the encampment were a little bit different. The sort of the culture, the nature of the relationships in the community were different. So we came up with an assessment tool, and I'd be happy to share it, but it's an assessment tool of an encampment that uses, we had public health, police, our general services that did some of the kind of cleaning work, and our outreach teams all kind of organize how do we want to understand the nature of an encampment, and came in to these kind of 6 broad groupings. The first is just the actual size. And a large, medium encampment is going to be different in every community. In LA, a large encampment could be several hundred people. In Marin County, a large encampment could actually be 12 people. So this is sort of contextual based on the nature of the community that you're in, but it's useful to actually define this so that your community is having a consistent strategy around engagement, and an approach to encampment decommissioning based on size. So think about how your unsheltered homelessness is distributed across the CFC or across your geography, and then group them by large, which will make sense for your community, medium, and then what I term hotspots. Hotspots are typically one person or maybe a very small group, 2, possibly 3, usually not more than 4 or 5 people in one area. Then we look at the location characteristics. And again, the approach to both outreach to the encampment and the process of developing a decommissioning strategy is going to be different. Is it private land where you're going to have to interact with a private landowner? Are there neighboring properties or businesses that are going to be impacted by the outreach work? And so you might want to develop a relationship with them to let them know what's happening. How visible is the encampment? And that might determine, especially, it is increasingly become, unsheltered homelessness is becoming sort of a political issue in communities, and the extent to which it's very visible in a prominent either downtown or business area, that's going to dictate how you as an outreach or as a community respond when there's a lot of public pressure or political pressure because of the visibility. Look at the criminal activity. We often conflate unsheltered homelessness with other kinds of activities that might occur either adjacent or part of an encampment, but they're very different. If there's drug dealing, human trafficking, it will definitely require engagement with your police or the criminal justice system to ensure that you have the resources and the approaches that make sense based on the nature of that encampment. Then we look at the population of people that are in the encampment, and if it warrants a specialized approach, different kinds of services, looking at how we're going to be making referrals to housing. Do we have the right kinds of housing mixes or services based on how acute, if there's an elderly population, if there's people living in cars with children, does that dictate how we're going to go in and the approach? Looking at environmental health issues. if people are using fuel to burn fires and that creates a hazardous condition, maybe there's bio waste that needs to be cleaned, other conditions around vermin. We look at also community safety issues. If the encampment is close to oncoming traffic or under an overpass, and there's the risk of people coming in contact with oncoming traffic, that elevates often the sense of urgency to manage that encampment and a decommissioning process in a different way. And then also just once an encampment is it's slated for a decommissioning, trying to understand what the role is for general services or solid waste to come in and dispose of materials that are not the belongings of individuals and left behind. We need to manage that process as well. So for each of these areas, I think there's a scale and there's a narrative section, and allows us to define the encampment and then also to rank in terms of urgency or crisis, and then stage the approach to the particular encampment based on how acute or how urgent the need is to address that particular one.
And Matt, can I
yeah,
one other quick point? I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I think you alluded to this as well, but I just want to say that in Columbus, when we did not nearly as much as Matt, you've done in other communities, but a little bit of this and started organizing around encampments, part of the approach we took was to insist on housing capacity equivalent to the encampment being decommissioned.
mm-hmm.
And so from a system vantage point, it gave us a point of leverage to negotiate for more investment in housing, and particularly low barrier housing, if possible. But just to kind of make the point that no one, as you said earlier, Matt, is just sort of intentionally and involuntarily moved from a place they're living, an encampment or what have you, without a viable next option that meets them where they are. And as you've said so well, Matt, some people are, where you're meeting them is in their small community with their chosen families. Mm-hmm. So how do you address that? Is this part of your assessment, Matt?
And this is an assessment for staging communities for decommissioning, but I want to be clear, not every community is at a point where they're decommissioning encampments. And I totally agree with this, Tom, if you do not have the housing capacity, the resources on the back end to actually make a referral to either an interim step, if that's the most appropriate, or directly to housing through rapid rehousing or market rate housing if they have employment or income, or PSH, or whatever the housing strategy is, then the recommendation is not to do any kind of decommissioning or relocation, because it doesn't contribute to a community goal and certainly doesn't address the ultimate unsheltered crisis just by relocating to another jurisdiction. So in all of these examples that I'm giving, where we're doing these assessments and staging these communities, it's only doing a decommissioning when there's a housing resource directly linked to every single person who's in the encampment. There's another set of assessments that are specific to just a housing focused assessment. And so going into an encampment, say it's 20 people, in the communities where I worked, that means we have to have 20 housing referrals in our back pocket ready to make, or offers that are legitimate offers. And for some people, the take-up rate is going to be great and they'll move directly into their own apartment within a week. Probably likely there's going to be a more phased approach that might have interim steps, but we don't decommission unless there's a housing strategy attached to every single person in the encampment. So that, I think, is I just wanted to underscore that piece. But and this is going to be the case in California, there aren't housing resources readily available for every person who's unsheltered. So if we look at the next slide, this kind of refers to the kind of outreach and how you respond to encampments. And it might be that outreach and engagement is as much capacity as you have, and you don't have the housing resources, at least not immediately today, to offer. So the focus is really on connection, and getting people connected to services and resources that might help them, but there isn't a specific encampment that you're targeting for decommissioning. Another approach is to look at if there is an encampment, whether or not it makes sense to provide basic services to people in that setting, whether that's safety, maybe some patrols, maybe you can bring services on site to address a particular need that you've identified. An example here is that's often considered as something like safe parking, where you identify a parking lot or a particular region, and you provide resources to people in that area. So it's a sanctioned encampment. Another approach is a sanctioned encampment, but you have a relocation process. So people are moved from either an unsheltered location that's in an inappropriate or unsafe location to a designated camping area that either provides more opportunity for engagement, increased safety, or a linkage to some housing resource that's tied to that encampment. So that might be part of your strategy, a sanctioned encampment that's part of your relocation process. Another approach is just periodic cleaning, where part of your encampment is to make sure that if there are belongings or trash or bio waste that's providing a public health concern, that you're addressing that by identifying a cleaning strategy. Strategies that don't work, but that are identified for some locations is clearance and closure, where residents are you help them find an alternative housing, you give them notification, you support them through outreach, but they can't return to that encampment after a certain amount of time. Oftentimes in these kinds of approaches, clearance and closure, there isn't a housing resource that's always attached to it. So it's not one of the ones that we recommend or that's often successful, but sometimes the politics or the circumstances or the location warrant an immediate closure because of health or safety issues. Always, we want to ensure that people are given the kinds of resources and supports to maintain their housing. But it's not unlikely that people will go back to a place that's familiar to them, where they have friends or a community that felt like their home. So we have to have a very thoughtful conversation with people in encampments about what does it mean to come back to the area, whether it's panhandling or engaging in activity that is not appropriate. So coming up with a prevention strategy, and there's a whole nother sort of webinar on engaging people in a prevention strategy so that you don't reestablish encampment areas. And then finally, I have it on the slide here because it is an approach that some communities use, but as we've mentioned before, it's not particularly successful. It doesn't result in resolving homelessness, and it is, for the most part, traumatic and causes more harm. And that's just the criminalization, where there is a citation for loitering or for nuisance, and you're forcing people to either move along without an alternative, or you're criminalizing what is essentially just extreme poverty. Not the best approach. So let's
and adding more barriers, Matt, right?
And and then they have to resolve those, all of those warrants or fines or whatever. So it's not going to result in anything. So I want to share 3 examples. Houston, as I mentioned before, I was able to work with in an intensive way and develop an outreach strategy that had an encampment decommissioning component to it. And there's a whole report that was written on how that process works. It's also been written up in the New York Times, and so you can just do a Google search and find a great article about the results from Houston. I also wanted to find an example from California, so I have an example that we'll share there, and then some recent work in Seattle around creating something called a housing central command, or a command structure that helps to organize outreach efforts, and it's tied to their encampment strategy. So we'll talk about that one. So Houston. At the beginning of the pandemic, well, first I'll just give you some of the highlights for the sort of attributes of Houston. The lead community, the lead organization for the CFC is called the Houston Coalition. And they received significant public funding during the pandemic through the CARES Act. So that was ESG, coronavirus, or ESG-CV. They also had ARPA funds, and they had one of these downtown management districts that also invested resources with the focus on decommissioning encampments rather than standing up non-congregate shelter. At the beginning of the pandemic, many communities were approaching the public health crisis by separating people or creating safe distance and decongregating or creating individual shelter units to arrest the spread of COVID. Houston made a slightly different, a significantly different choice. Rather than invest the energy and resources and time to create non-congregate shelter, Houston said, well, why don't we just house them? We're going to go through all of this extra work to create non-congregate shelter. That's about the same energy and complication and time it would take to just house them. So why don't we just house them? So that was the beginning of their decommissioning, their encampment decommissioning process, is because they put all of their COVID resources into housing rather than into emergency shelter. They looked at 3 different core responses: diversion, which is a modest amount of financial assistance to reconnect people to safe alternative housing, often family and friends; scaling up rapid rehousing using private landlords with a 12-month subsidy renewable to 24 months if people still needed it; and then traditional PSH. And they used their PSH existing inventory, and they projected out the amount of regular turnover or regular slots of PSH that would become available during the course of a year. And then they sort of, they bridged people to those expected PSH units using rapid rehousing. So everyone got rapid rehousing as an immediate response to the public health crisis. Many of the people who were eligible for PSH were placed into rapid rehousing, and that rapid rehousing was simply just a bridge. So they maintained that same tenant-based unit, but it transitioned to permanent housing when there was a natural opening in PSH, and so that client could just be transitioned. So that was their response to the pandemic. These outreach teams then coordinated with housing navigators so that they had landlords, they had housing units in their back pocket, and they could do a warm handoff. So when they were doing outreach and they would contact and do an engagement, there was always a housing resource attached to that. And there was always a warm handoff to support the project-based case managers. So the rapid rehousing or PSH case manager. So the outreach, the navigation, and the case management and housing all coordinated in a warm handoff to ensure that that transition was successful for the client. We then looked at each encampment, the number of people in the encampment, and the number of housing resources that we would need, and we would plan for a week-long housing surge event. So this typically would take, we would start the planning maybe 4 to 6 weeks out. The typical encampment was around 25 to 30 people. We would ensure that housing was available, and then we would kind of build our active engagement, knowing that the encampment was going to be decommissioned and people would be given a choice about where to live, but they weren't given a choice about staying in the encampment. That was very clear that the encampment would close, it would be decommissioned, and everyone was provided a housing resource. And then that process of actually closing the camp occurred in 1 week, when all the outreach and all the housing providers were sort of on site to help manage that process. And those were basically housing surge events, and we did 1 a month. So now let's look at how this plays out when you're doing a housing surge during the course of a week. On this slide at the top is a typical Monday, and you can see on this particular roadway, all of the tents or the temporary shelters sort of interspersed within the trees. And leading up to this event, every single person was assessed. Everyone had a housing strategy. So by the first day, by Tuesday, we'd already engaged everyone. We'd already started the move out process. Midway through the week on Wednesday, you can see most of the tents are gone and all the belongings are sort of organized so that they can transition or be moved with the housing to the person. And by the end of the week, there was just 1 or 2 tents left. The part of the strategy of doing these housing surge events, number one, everyone has to have housing. We do not, in Texas or in Houston, they did not initiate a decommissioning unless there was a housing resource for everyone in the encampment. And number two, there had to be a strategy for maintaining the clearance once it was decommissioned. So there was an active participation with neighborhood groups, community organizations, police, the downtown redevelopment district or management district to ensure that there was ongoing outreach to the region that was decommissioned even after everyone left. And if there was one person that had set up a lean-to or a temporary structure or a tent, they were immediately engaged and redirected to a housing resource, so that visibly the nature of that encampment becomes redefined as public space that's available for everyone and is no longer an identified encampment. So you can see, and in fact, I'm in Houston today. This is what this area looks like today. It is a park-like setting with these trees, and this was from a year and a half ago. So for the past year and a half, it has maintained the status of not being an encampment. The next example I want to share is from California. So Salinas, Monterey, San Benito County. I think some of the characteristics of this particular region, it's obviously not nearly the concentration or the intensity of Houston, but there's several attributes that I think are worthy of mentioning. Multiple outreach teams, and often the different outreach teams have a particular focus, whether that's geographic, or they're a specific population, whether it's youth, or they have a specialization, mental illness. In the past, those would be seen as disparate, separate outreach efforts, but coordinating the street outreach among all of those teams, even though they're not serving exactly the same clientele, is a form of care coordination, and it's getting a more comprehensive sort of visual understanding of the community, and you're able to build a more comprehensive outreach strategy then by integrating the strategies of different teams. Ensuring that your outreach serve as access points so that it's not just outreach for outreach sake, but it's outreach that results in a connection to or an engagement as part of your system. And this includes the full spectrum. So not doing an intake, full assessment, helping with the application process, and then supporting unsheltered persons through the housing referral process. Another attribute of Monterey that I think is interesting is they have an open data system. So this allows them to support care coordination. If I see an individual who's engaged in outreach, but they're not on my caseload, I can access the HMIS to understand who is the care coordinator or the case manager, and drop in a note or understand what's the next step. And maybe I can communicate with the unsheltered individual about, okay, you're actively applying for housing and you're waiting for, there was a denial, and so you've resubmitted application, and I can provide that information even though I'm not the case manager or the care coordinator, but I'm delivering through an open system the ability to understand where that person is in the process, and if there's any kind of glitch or problem that I might be able to help troubleshoot. And then finally, the outreach coordination across multiple teams and an alignment across the whole community strategy. I don't know. I'm just wondering if there are any questions or if this is a good pause point or if we should keep.
I don't think there are any, Matt. I've been dropping some comments in the chat just related to
Oh, great. Okay. The next example then, moving on from California, is to Seattle. As I mentioned before, there's this emerging model that Seattle, a couple of other communities have started to refine, called a housing command center or central command. And the idea is that you physically locate outreach, housing resources, navigation resources, and often system resources in one physical location that allows you to sort of accelerate the coordination without having to like leave messages or emails and wait for people to get back here. Everyone is literally in the same room. It's almost like a disaster response when you have an emergency response team that's physically located in the same room to coordinate care. So this is the Seattle model. They're looking at decommissioning large downtown encampments, very urban in nature. And they had multiple data sets that they were able to draw from. So they integrated data, not just from their HMIS, but from public health systems and the criminal justice system. And this allowed them to build a complete picture. So as they were developing a care coordination plan, if there were outstanding warrants, someone maybe had medication coordination or management that they needed to be built into their housing plan. Other people were frequent users of crisis response, whether that was an emergency room or psychiatric care. And so that was built into their response, knowing that they were frequent users. So the integrated multiple data sets was a characteristic of the Seattle approach. Targeted outreach and housing resources, again, paired together. And it was based on data. So they looked at the highest concentration of persons in a single encampment, not necessarily the ones that were drawing the most community complaints. So this is driven by data, not driven by sort of the emotional, the heightened sort of political response to unsheltered homelessness. And it allows them to fall back when they're then dealing with questions around efficacy or staging of why you're going to this particular encampment and not another one. They were able to respond to that with saying that they were informed by data-based decisions rather than just sort of the, roaming quickly all over the community trying to put Band-Aids everywhere. It was very focused, intentional response in one targeted area. The other piece that characterizes the Seattle response is a very thoughtful and intentional approach to how they're managing the disparate impact of unsheltered homelessness on certain populations. Their Black and Indigenous populations are overrepresented in their unsheltered counts, as are persons who identify as LGBT. And so they developed partnerships with culturally specific organizations that were able to provide the kind of engagement resources and using in a peer-based way, using staff who had come from an unsheltered or from a lived experience of homelessness that looked and could share the same kinds of experiences as a better strategy for engagement. And that also has resulted in stronger connections, better engagement, accelerated housing placements, because the focus is providing culturally specific services with staff who look like the clients that they're serving. I think those are some great examples of what works in other communities.
Right. Well, Matt, thank you for walking us through that. And I'll piggyback on that point about representation and making sure teams and staff and all the way up the ladder look like the people being engaged is so critical. And part of that, of course, to state the obvious, is driven by the data itself. And so when we take a moment to look at national, and we're not going to talk through all these points with you right now, but we wanted to get it in front of you. It will inform and help to direct our work. And frankly, it'll give us grounding and perhaps at times the sort of the backing we need to have a more rights-based approach, as you put it, Matt, a data-based approach to driving our resources. Of course, there are still times when communities are just being reactive. And as a continuum of care, as a system, as a homeless service provider, sometimes we just have to go with the flow and make it work and be as principled as possible. But when we talk about this data, I think it's important we have both national and state and community context. We wanted to just draw a couple major points, why we're talking about unsheltered homelessness more than we ever have in my career, and Matt and I have been doing this a long time, and there's not been this much focus ever before. And we're all glad there is focus and there needs to be more. Partly it's driven by the growing, as we all probably know, if you don't know the numbers, you surely see people in your community, the growing number of people who are unsheltered. And nationally, it is ballooning. I think in California especially, which has the almost a little bit more than half or about half of all unsheltered people in the country live in California. It is a growing problem, and it's a growing national dialogue. So we really have an obligation to be as informed as we can. And there's some contours to these numbers I want to just draw out. As Matt, you just said, we see disproportionate impact all the way down the ladder to the street, from people, just generally in our communities. And then we start to look at people who are in poverty, and then we start to look at people who are in deep poverty. And then we might look at people who are without housing and perhaps without food security, and are really struggling the most economically, all the way down to people who are unhoused on the street, arguably in some of the worst conditions a community can have. And every step down that ladder, we see growing disproportionality, particularly among Black and Brown people, and also among LGBTQ plus folks and others. Perhaps not discussed as much as it should be is the growing disproportionate impact among people with a disabling condition, one or more disabling conditions. And that's something we also want to point out here, is increasingly people who are experiencing literal homelessness of any form are reporting one or more significant, persistent disabling conditions. And so we have a growing number of folks who are both struggling with a disability and who are aging at the same time, right? So growing vulnerability and need among people experiencing homelessness. This is perhaps best illustrated in work I've done separately in Sacramento recently to help them with their gaps analysis and building on their point in time count. When we did the analysis or looked at the point in time count data, in particular, we found very troubling trends. One is that 58% of adults now reporting at least one or more severe persistent disabling conditions. This is up from 40% just a handful of years ago. This was the 2022 point in time count. So there's a 3-year gap there, but it's growing. Now we can say definitively the majority of adults in Sacramento County who are unsheltered have at least one, but likely multiple severe persistent disabling conditions as they're reporting it. And when we looked at the survey data and examined what was going on with folks in terms of using local homeless assistance resources, we also found that not only could people not access assistance when they wanted it, oftentimes if it was available, they wouldn't access it because it wasn't a trauma-informed, humane option for them, or did not seem like a reasonable, viable option for them. Oftentimes, of course, because of issues people struggle with and the community they create when they have to out in a location in the community. So these are important things we have to be aware of. Beyond that, though, and I just to sort of underline this point around disabling conditions, the California Policy Lab, as some of you may know, conducted a national survey. It wasn't limited just to people in California. Very large survey, 3-year survey. I want to say it concluded in 2019. I'm going off of memory there, but not that long ago. And their key finding, this is their headline, quote in their finding. I'll just let you sort of read it for a moment. It speaks to, again, what people are saying they're struggling with and what they need, what they're finding when they're trying to access assistance. And instead of getting help that's trauma-informed, it's person-centered, that meets people. I hate to say an old social work adage, but I will, meet people where they are. Instead of criminalizing them, we're hearing that exact feedback from people who are currently unhoused as to what their needs are and where we're not meeting the mark as a community. So this is important that we remind ourselves of this qualitative information. And lastly, to bring forward something that was just published about a month or two ago. The UCSF Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative did a massive survey of adults 18 years and older experiencing homelessness in California. And it's really getting a lot of attention for good reason. And I think Matt would agree, we as a field haven't had this much information. Granted, it's particular to California, but it's not unique to California. But we haven't had this much sort of qualitative feedback compiled in a rigorous way that is empirically sound and representative in a long time. I would argue since early work in the late 90s and 2000s that we haven't seen this amount of, I haven't, information. And there's a lot here. We just sort of pulled forward some of the key findings. There's a lot in this report. We all have an obligation to spend some time with this information and to reflect on it and to think about the services and responses that our community is offering to people. But mainly, I think about this as well as an opportunity to give us better insight as to where to direct our attention and how to provide help. And one thing that stands out to me in the Benioff data is what people are saying in terms of their recent experience prior to completing the survey, in particular where they were before they entered homelessness. And of course, we have other data in HMIS that gives us clues as to where folks are coming from and where they're going. These become important points beyond, decommissioning a camp or engaging somebody who's already unsheltered. Just tells us maybe where we need to have more robust partnerships and opportunities for folks before they hit the street and see if we can't help them avoid that. And we know as well that most people, nearly half, are coming from unstable housing situations where they have no control. They're not the leaseholder, they're living with friends or family, and is very tenuous. So that speaks to the need, Matt, you said this earlier, but the importance of diversion or rapid resolution, or we can call it lots of different things, but bottom line is just about housing problem solving and helping folks maybe reconcile with a friend or family for even a little while they get on a longer term housing pathway. Matt, did you want to add in something?
One of the, I think the striking things from this study, and I always get so frustrated when community or public officials say, well, people are coming to California because we have such rich services and there's so much public investment directed to unsheltered and to housing resources now that it's attracting, it has this magnet effect. And one of the interesting findings from the Benioff study is that the vast majority, and I don't know what the percentage is, but it's like 90% of people become homeless in the community that they grew up in. There is a one-time kind of crisis or event that contributes to their housing loss. They're not moving to California. So it's a really useful tool to help kind of eliminate, better communicate and eliminate that myth with community members or public officials who don't want to make the necessary investments in the homelessness system because they feel like it just attracts or it creates a magnet for people from other jurisdictions who are moving to California to take advantage of those rich resources.
Good point. And I wish now I would have dropped that bullet in here, but that jumped out to me as well. It's a myth buster, right? And Matt, I think your point is that we have a job to do to dispel myths, and we can do that most readily with empirical data. And that's why this study is so important. It is, and why it's getting so much national attention. It was done rigorously, and this is very, very reliable, and we can say representative people we are trying to help. So there's a couple other things as well. Just again, we sort of cherry picked some of these from the report. There's a lot more in the report, but there are some things here that I think are telling and give us some indication as to how to focus our strategies to help people who are unsheltered, but also to better understand the challenges and characteristics of folks. And I thought some of the points here, particularly around again, health issues, as we noted, are really emphasized here and are clearly an issue. And then finally, I would add that there are challenges around trauma. In the earlier slide, you saw the data point around how many people experience traumatizing events and carry that with them. If we know anything about trauma, we know it doesn't go away. And we know we have a responsibility to be ready for helping people who have gone through trauma, experience it, and maybe currently experiencing it. And so again, it speaks to the nature, the importance of doing things right and in a non-punitive way. It doesn't heap on trauma and harm. And I'll just conclude that point before we turn to some resources and open up for any questions by saying, as a licensed social worker, I have an ethical obligation to do no more harm. And I don't really care if you're licensed or not. If you're in this space and you're doing this work, you have the same ethical obligation. And as Matt, as you said earlier, this really has to be where we start, where the work starts, particularly with our community partners and our law enforcement friends who are trying to do the right thing, but just using the tools they're used to often. So we need to also engage our partners and help them see a path forward that is productive and meets the community's needs and doesn't create more harm for some members of our community. So with that, I just want to turn us briefly to a few more resources. These are things that you will find helpful when the slides go out. You'll be able to access these links pretty readily, but there are some newer national strategies, particularly in the All Inside initiative from USICH, we'll all want to be paying attention to. And if you don't know by now, you probably will soon, but HUD has made significant, for the first time ever, investments in addressing unsheltered homelessness. And there's new support coming to communities, including the whole state of California, which I believe Matt's might be latched into. And so anyway, more to come around unsheltered homelessness, but now we want to just stop showing our screen and stop talking so much and just open it up for questions. And Chris, I'm going to punt over to you to help facilitate.
Thanks, Tom. I've been combing the chat here as we got ready for this. I haven't seen any questions per se, so I'd love to have folks just either put something in the chat or go ahead and come off mute and talk to Matt and Tom about this topic. I think it's, I know for me here in Denver, it's definitely a real thing, dealing with unsheltered. I live right downtown and I see it every day. And the way in which we're dealing with it is not any way in which Matt or Tom described today, or the way we had been, the way we're going to. Hopefully sounds more in line. So love to hear thoughts, how things are working in your community, some obstacles you might have come across, anything in that realm. Please feel free to come off mute and ask your question. You see that in the chat? You want me to read that to you, Tom? I think you got it.
I can read it. Matt, I'll let you take a first take at it.
Yeah, so it looks like the question is, what would you all suggest would be effective strategies to build engagement with those that are unsheltered? A couple of strategies that I'm helping to support in communities that seem to work is a peer model. It works on a couple of levels. So engaging people who are unsheltered, building their economic capacity by actually paying them to accompany you with unsheltered. They often have information about where people are. They're paired with a trained clinician. So it's both building the capacity of the peer person, but it's also providing a stronger, more sort of real life connection to unsheltered people because they see someone maybe that they know or that has experienced unsheltered homelessness. So that's one engagement strategy, actually employing people with lived experience to be paired with your more clinical or professionally trained staff. The other piece, I think I mentioned this, but I just want to underscore it if I didn't, that persistence, that oftentimes people who are unsheltered have experienced trauma and and a series of setbacks and disappointments and frustrations in their own lives. And so the prospect of engaging in housing oftentimes feels for people like one more opportunity to fail. And the way to confront that is through persistence, client-centered engagement, where you're addressing what is the individual's goal, what is of most importance to them. And oftentimes it's not about housing, but that's okay. If it's not about housing, but they can articulate reunification with a loved one. Maybe they want to go back to a community that they lived in when they were young, or that they do have family or social connections. Maybe they have a relationship that they want to develop or rekindle or address that's been fractured from the past. If we can tie that to housing, that interest, that goal, what's important to them in that moment, connect it to some kind of housing goal, you're more likely to maintain long-term engagement. So using people with lived experience as part of your outreach strategy, and recognizing that people are going to have different goals that often are not housing focused, at least not initially, and that's okay. But we need to tie or connect their interests, their goals to a housing focus, and ultimately you'll hopefully that will land with them.
I'll just add to that quickly, Matt. I think I work in a community in Ohio called Clinton County. Clinton County has 40,000 or so residents, so it's on the one end of a spectrum of communities I work with. And their outreach focuses on a few, believe it or not, very large encampments that would rival any urban area that kind of go under the radar in Clinton County. And their approach to engagement, I think, is it's simple, it's basic, and it really makes sense. Is they take food, and that's a need everyone has, and everyone that they visit is happy to receive food and other hygiene and other personal items, and it's a way to start a conversation. I'm probably stating the obvious, but I do feel like sometimes it can be as basic as that. But the downside of that is, and I'm going to add to what you said too, Matt, is it has to be housing. There has to be an intent there, right? And I would argue a commitment to see somebody through to a more stable, safe place to live. And that today, that might not even be a concern of theirs. They might be totally great with where they are. They got their buddies down there. Their camp is set up fine. They're relatively safe. They're not necessarily asking for housing. What I found, and Matt, it speaks to your point around persistence, is not only do we need to be persistent, but we have an obligation to, I think, spread hope, if I could put it that way, and give people a reason to not be dispirited and feel like this is just going to be another failure. So I'm not going to talk about housing, but hey, you want to give me some bags of food, that's great. What I find is that in certain instances, street outreach staff doing the best job they can may have inadvertently conveyed a sense of hopelessness, because they say, there just is no affordable housing. It's that problem that exists only in our community and everywhere else, right? Which is that we don't have any affordable housing, so there really isn't a solution, and we unintentionally sometimes, I think, inspire a lack of hope. And I just think we have an obligation to not do that, number one. And of course, in some communities, there's not necessarily any housing that's easy to find. But Matt, you said this earlier, I'm going to connect a big dot here. When we're serious about getting people off the street, and perhaps they're extremely vulnerable and have other conditions that merit an all hands, all in approach, then we need to be able to have a coordinated outreach strategy approach that allows us to prioritize people carte blanche in an encampment if it's being mitigated, or individually, depending on their needs and what we're trying to do with that location, right? And I think this is where we actually do have some flexibility and nimbleness as communities in our coordinated entry policies and procedures to make them work in the moment in high priority situations, and for high priority or high vulnerability folks. And so I just think there's a big kind of bundle of things there. Most of all, we need to make sure we get our housing and our other viable interim solutions, if that's what has to be offered. As Matt, you said, everyone has a housing resource, bar none. And so what does that look like? And when we do that, then we can inspire hope. And when we go all the way back to engagement and starting the conversation, we can say, no, I'm going to stick with you until you're in a safe, stable place. I know it seems pretty hopeless. I know you've struck out many times, but that's my job. And I'll be back tomorrow or see you when you're ready to see me again. And just stay at that persistence. So I hate to go on about that, but I think there's a lot there that we have a responsibility to orchestrate and then bring to the street level, to the individual conversation. And that I think gives us a basis for engagement. That's my yammering. Let's see other questions, but I'll again invite folks to come off mute or drop in the chat. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'll just say, well, and maybe while people are thinking about a question, something that you mentioned, Tom, that occurred to me that I just wanted to riff on a little bit. I often encounter this this misconception that you can't do encampment decommissioning because it's inconsistent with HUD's coordinated entry prioritization guidance. That going into one area and offering a housing resource to everyone, regardless of their acuity level, is somehow inconsistent or in violation of HUD's guidance for coordinated entry prioritization. And it couldn't be further from the truth. And so I just want to, that if you're concerned about how to manage your coordinated entry process in a way that is aligned or consistent with HUD guidance, it absolutely is possible to do that in a geographically specific encampment decommissioning way. The two are not incompatible. So just wanted to be crystal clear about that.
Yeah, and I'll give a concrete example. Sacramento, right as we speak, is working out new coordinated access policies around same-day placement into shelter. And the top end of that same-day policy in terms of vulnerability is a guaranteed placement to shelter. Right. And so they're starting with, as you put it, Matt, not a complaint driven, but, a person-centered approach, starting with vulnerability. And so in other words, who did they pull all the stops out for as a community and guarantee playing out like, okay, here's our plan A, which is the next available shelter bed that meets your needs. Here's our plan B, and here's our plan C. You play out all the scenarios and you start at the top with, who's most vulnerable. And it could be, and this is what, I'm not speaking for Sacramento, by the way, I'm just giving an example of what they're processing. Are there other types of same day placement scenarios or needs, including that camp that has to close by a date certain? And so it's not necessarily a same day access guarantee, but it is a access guarantee for a defined geographic area that's going through mitigation or decommissioning or whatever we call it by a date certain. So there's a guarantee of a housing solution or a viable interim placement by a date. So that means no one is told just pick up and move, right? But they're just starting on that journey. They're nowhere near as far along as some of the other communities Matt highlighted. Not yet.
All right, ask one last time if you have anything in the chat, if you want to come off mute and ask a question or say how things are going in your community that we can learn from that, we'll give you that moment. And if not, we'll begin to wrap up. All right, not saying any. Matt, Tom, you have any closing remarks before we close out?
I should have thought of something pithy and inspiring. It's hard work, and it's just really challenging work, and I think it requires a total community response, and it's just not easy.
But it can be done. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
I think we need to believe in our core that we can do this. The pandemic just showed us this isn't about how to do this. This is about whether we have the will and we're willing to put the resources into it. And those resources really aren't audacious, I think is what we learned. So
That's great.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and attending this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solution Grant Coronavirus Relief Staffing and Services Contract. There will be a survey that pops up after the end of the session. Feel free to give us any feedback that you have. And as I mentioned, this is our last community workshop. So thank you for being here and have a good rest of your day.